The night the river froze solid enough to scream, Mara knew something was wrong before the knocking started, because the wind had gone quiet, as if the world were holding its breath. And she and Eli were counting the last coins on the table, deciding which bill could wait, when the door shook once, twice, and then a third time that sounded like bone on wood. And when Eli opened it, an old woman fell forward into the light, snow crusted in her hair, lips blue, eyes sharp as knives, whispering a name neither of them knew. And behind her, the fields were white and endless, and the sky hung low like a lid. And Mara thought of the baby they had buried last spring, and felt the house tilt. But she caught the woman before she hit the floor, and felt how light she was, how heavy the moment was. And the old woman gripped Mara's wrist with surprising strength and hissed, "Do not let the fire die. Not tonight, not for them." And then she passed out. And as Eli dragged her inside and barred the door, the stove coughed and went dark, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. And somewhere far off, the ice cracked again, louder, closer, as if something enormous were waking beneath it. And Mara realized the winter had just begun, and it had come with teeth. They wrapped the old woman in every blanket they owned, tore up a curtain for bandages when they found blood frozen along her calf, and argued in whispers about whether to send for help. Because help meant debt, and debt meant the land, and the land was the only thing still warm between them. But the old woman woke and laughed, a dry rattle that made the lamp flicker, and said help would not cross the river tonight, not after what she had done. And when Mara demanded to know who she was, the woman named the families who had lived there before, named the wells that had been filled, named the bones under the barn. And Eli went pale, because those were stories his father had sworn were lies. And then the woman said she had walked from the far bend, where the ice had swallowed a man whole an hour earlier, and that his boots were still standing upright on the bank, like he was waiting to be filled back in. And the stove refused to relight, no matter how Eli cursed at it. And the cold sharpened, and Mara felt watched, as if the walls had thinned and the fields were listening. And the old woman smiled with no kindness at all and said, "Winter always collects its debts," and it had come for theirs. The wind returned with a howl that pressed snow through the cracks. And when Mara went to fetch water, the bucket came up black with silt, the well ruined in a single night. And the old woman nodded, as if checking items off a list, and told them to stop fighting each other and start listening, because the river would break by morning and take the bridge, because the wolves would follow the ice road to the yard, because the man who drowned would not stay quiet. And Eli shouted that she was mad and tried to throw her out. But the door would not open, frozen fast, and when he struck it with an axe, the blade stuck as if the wood had turned to iron. And the old woman began to pray in a language that made Mara's ears ring. And the lamp went out, and in the dark something thudded against the walls, slow and patient, counting the house. And Mara understood that whatever the woman had done out there had dragged the night closer, and that the winter was not weather, but a witness, and it was watching to see who would be offered first. As dawn crept thin and grey, the knocking returned from inside the walls, and the old woman smiled and reached for Mara's hand, whispering that this was the choice she had come for. And Mara felt the floor warm under her feet, as if the fire had found its way back through blood and promise, and she knew the winter would remember whatever they decided next. Outside, the ice screamed again, closer than before, sealing the night around them. It was only the beginning, and none of them were ready. Slowly, by the time the grey light hardened into morning, the house felt smaller, as if the winter had pushed its shoulders inside and refused to leave. And the old woman sat upright at the table without blankets, her wound sealed by a dark, puckered scar that had not been there hours earlier, while Mara watched in silence and Eli counted the remaining matches with shaking hands. And outside, the wolves made no sound at all, which was worse than howling. And the woman finally spoke, telling them the river had taken her husband 40 years ago, on a night like this, and had never stopped asking for replacements. Only patience, only time, and that the man who drowned last night had tried to cross with a debt in his pocket, land bought cheap with another family's ruin, and that the river had recognized the theft. And Eli laughed too loudly and said, "Rivers don't think." But when he went to the window, he saw the ice pulling apart in slow, deliberate lines like fingers opening, and something dark rolled just beneath the surface, keeping pace with his gaze, and he stepped back as if burned. The old woman said the bridge would fall by noon, the road would vanish, and the wolves would come when hunger outweighed fear. And Mara asked why she was here, why their door, and the woman answered that grief leaves a scent, and theirs was strong enough to taste, and that winter listens best to the desperate. And Mara felt the buried ache in her chest twist, because it was true, because since the baby died, the house had felt hollow and loud at the same time, and she had begged the cold to end everything more than once. And the woman said, "Wishes are invitations, and invitations are rarely declined." When Eli tried again to light the stove, it flared suddenly, violently, scorching his knuckles. And the woman smiled and said the fire would burn as long as it was fed honestly. And Mara understood she did not mean wood. They heard shouting near the river before noon, distant at first, then frantic. And when Mara climbed the loft ladder to look, she saw 3 men on the ice, one on his knees, one pulling, one already half submerged, and the river cracked with a sound like laughter. And Eli grabbed his coat to run. But the woman blocked the door and said if he went, the house would go with him, because the winter had weighed them already and found them light, and it would take what it could carry. Eli shoved her aside, and the door burst open at last, spilling white fury inside, and in that instant Mara saw the future split, saw Eli dragged under with the others, saw herself alone with the old woman and the wolves, and she screamed his name, and the sound felt like tearing cloth. And the woman seized Mara's wrist again and drove her thumbnail into the scar from the baby's birth, sharp enough to draw blood, and whispered, "Choose." And the fire roared high as if answering, and Mara slammed the door shut on Eli's back, bolting it with a strength she did not know she had. And his fists battered the wood while the shouting outside turned to silence, one voice at a time, and the wolves finally howled, close now, thrilled. And the old woman began to chant again, louder, faster, and the house shook but held, and when the noise ended there was only the river's slow grinding and Eli's breathing on the other side of the door, ragged and alive, and Mara slid down the wall sobbing because she knew what she had offered. And the old woman stroked her hair and said winter always takes something, but sometimes it leaves something too. And when the bridge collapsed with a distant boom, the house went still, sealed in by snow and consequence, and the old woman closed her eyes as if resting, while outside the wolves circled, waiting for night to decide if the bargain was finished. Night fell early, thick and absolute, and the wolves did not attack so much as attend, sitting in a wide ring beyond the fence like mourners who knew patience. And the old woman woke at dusk, her eyes cloudy now, her voice thin, and told Mara the river was satisfied for the moment, but winter was not, because winter was older than bargains and kinder only when endings were clean. And Eli finally came inside, blue-lipped and shaking, carrying with him the weight of the men who had not made it back. And when he saw the old woman, he reached for the axe again, but Mara stopped him, because she understood now that violence would only amuse what listened beyond the walls. The woman said one debt remained unpaid, the first invitation, the whispered wish, and Mara felt the truth of it settle like ice in her lungs, and she asked what winter wanted. And the woman answered simply, remembrance, because forgetting is the cruelest theft of all. She told them the land they stood on had been taken during a winter famine, traded for silence, and that the river had never forgotten the woman who starved in that house clutching an empty cradle. And as she spoke, the floor creaked and the cold deepened, until breath fell like glass, and Eli began to cry, because he finally understood whose bones lay under the barn, and whose grief Mara had unknowingly echoed. The old woman rose, suddenly tall despite her age, and said it was time, and when Mara asked who would go, The woman smiled sadly and said she already had, because she was the river's memory-given legs, kept alive by being remembered. And tonight she would be finished. She walked to the door and it opened for her as if eager, and the wolves lowered their heads and the river groaned. And she turned back once and told Mara to live loudly, to fill the house with noise and love and names, or winter would return hungry. And then she stepped into the dark and was gone, and the cold retreated like a held breath released. Morning came pale and quiet. The wolves vanished, the river stilled, and the bridge lay broken but harmless. And when spring finally arrived, Mara found no bones under the barn, only rich black soil, and she planted there, and the crops grew fierce and tall, and the house warmed and stayed warm. And years later, when Mara held a living child and told them stories of a winter that listened, she always began with an old woman at the door, because remembering was the price that kept the river calm, and the winter at last forgot them.